Hello, my name is Anita Zariņa, and together with my colleague Ivo Vinogradov, we will present the landscape planning guidelines developed for local municipalities in Latvia. These guidelines were elaborated as part of Landscape and Green Infrastructure Regional Plan for the Zemgale planning region. The guidelines have been developed taking into account landscape planning and territorial planning traditions, as well as legal planning framework in Latvia. The purpose of the guidelines is to improve the understanding of landscape values, identification and assessment for planning purposes. It seeks to clarify the information that needs to be collected, analyzed and considered in a systematic manner in relation to landscape planning at local level. More specifically, this document gives the framework for policies and statutory documents that are binding for landscape assessment and planning in Latvia. It describes a range of landscape aspects that can be characterized and analyzed during the landscape assessment process. It sets out an approach for identification of landscape quality objectives and clarifies its benefits for a long-term landscape planning, and proposes the principles for the elaboration of planning recommendations. The structure of the guidelines consists of 4 interconnected parts. First, there is a review of binding documents, among which are the European Landscape Convention, Latvian Landscape Policy, Spatial Development Planning Law, and other landscape plans at local or regional level that could be binding for the landscape thematic plan. The next steps of guidelines comprise landscape characterization and assessment, the identification of landscape quality objectives, and the elaboration of planning recommendations. I will describe these steps in more detail in the next slides. We recommend to start landscape analysis with general characterization of the territory, producing thematic maps that will describe natural conditions of the area. For example, the major landforms and soil pattern, water conditions, including flood risk territories. For understanding the diversity of landscape, the map of land use, land cover mosaics can be drawn. Useful for further landscape assessment will be the analysis of settlement pattern and settlement density, or maps of transportation infrastructure. Such assessment can be carried out using various secondary databases and geostatistical analysis. An important part of landscape thematic plan is the mapping and characterization of landscape objects that already are protected by various governmental and municipal institutions. These are specially protected nature areas, state-protected cultural heritage monuments. This may include also landscapes and elements protected at the local level. Within the framework of thematic plan, individual protection zones for cultural heritage monuments can be elaborated as well. Within the framework of landscape thematic plan, various specific landscape aspects can be addressed according to the planning needs articulated by the municipality. For example, accessibility to water bodies, tourism network analysis, historical landscape analysis, wind park locational analysis, visual and aesthetic landscape analysis, assessment and planning of green infrastructure, public spaces, as well as landscape change analysis. Such assessment, besides various data analysis, will require field research, including observations and interviews with various stakeholders and experts. Landscape quality includes the quality of the everyday living environment, well-being and identity. That is, it is broader than aesthetics of visual landscape or landscape cultural heritage. Thus, the identification of landscape quality objectives is the essential part of the plan, since it deals not only with the assessment of actual situation, but shows the potential and desirable landscape development trajectories for both outstanding and everyday landscapes. For identification of landscape quality objectives, a map of local landscape units should be elaborated to apply landscape quality objectives for a territorial unit. Further, it is suggested that landscape units are characterized developing landscape profile and describing them regarding landscape's natural conditions, cultural forms, values, changes, risks and conflict situations, and so on. For each of these landscape units, landscape qualities could be assessed. We'll speak about this in more detail in the next slides. And together with stakeholders, general landscape quality objectives identified and further actions for reaching these particular objectives formulated. During the regional landscape planning process, together with the various stakeholders, we developed a range of landscape qualities that can be assessed in each of a landscape unit. These are landscape diversity, historical structures and elements, cultural heritage, recreation, scenic and aesthetic landscape qualities, naturalness of landscape, spiritual landscape qualities, and uniqueness. Each of these qualities can be evaluated using a series of indicators. For example, to assess the naturalness of a landscape unit, indicators such as naturalness of watercourses, biologically valuable grasslands, proportions of specially protected nature areas, natural land cover, micro-reserves, or distribution and proportion of ameliorated areas could be used. Accordingly, landscape quality objectives would mean that these qualities should be maintained, improved, and created in particular territory. Further, in collaboration with stakeholders, a place-based landscape quality objectives must be set to define the particular, with place-based tasks on how to reach these particular qualities. In this slide, you can see landscape quality objectives developed for Zemgale Plain region. Zemgale planning region, sorry. Although they are common for the whole area, the particular tasks to reach them will be different from place to place. Many of these landscape quality objectives are directly related to the planning of green infrastructure as well. For example, preservation and development of natural landscape elements will be related to the issues of green infrastructure planning in river floodplains. Landscape visual qualities and landscape diversity will be attributable to the assessment and planning of landscape small elements. Almost all of the cultural heritage landscape elements in rural areas relate to various forms of green infrastructure. And here are some examples of green infrastructure in the Zemgale Plains as historically, visually, ecologically valuable landscape elements. In these photographs, you can see manorial parks, single farmsteads, tree rows, and fruit gardens, semi-natural habitats of river valleys. Therefore, green infrastructure can be conceptualized as landscape elements in diverse forms, as part of landscape diversity, as historical and culturally relevant landscape elements, as a recreational resource, as a nature value, as biologically valuable core areas, as well as landscape values at various national and regional scale. Planning these landscape qualities, therefore, means direct and indirect planning of green infrastructure as well. As to recommendations, in the guidelines, they are structured in three perspectives, depending on the planning context. For long-term planning, local landscape policy document can be developed, consisting of recommendations for local landscape governance, including a plan for further process of identification of landscape quality objectives. Landscape management recommendations would include rather short-term landscape actions directed towards enhancement of landscape qualities and reaching of landscape quality objectives, while recommendations for landscape protection would comprise those actions that are related to designation of landscape areas under the Local Protection Act. In practice, this would mean the incorporation of valuable landscapes into territorial plans in a form of particular zoning. For example, protected nature areas, valuable landscape areas, cultural heritage zones. To conclude, I will use Paul Selman's quote that the need for and success of landscape actions can only be judged in relation to carefully negotiated and articulated objectives for that particular locality. Thank you.